Hello friends and welcome to today's video. My name is Nonya and I am your real estate tutoress. On this channel, I bring you the best tips and tools to getting your real estate license. I also answer any questions you may have about the process. If you are new here, welcome and do consider subscribing. Today, we will be discussing disclosures when working with a seller. So disclosures when you're working with a seller. When you're working with a seller, it's different than when you work with a buyer. So the seller owns the home. The seller is trying to sell that home. And so there are certain disclosures that are needed when you're working with a seller, and also disclosures from the seller and disclosures from you to any potential buyers or buyer's agents. All right, so we're going to cover a bit of that in today's lesson. First vocabulary word we're going to talk about is material facts. Material facts are conditions about the property or issues with the property that, if known, could change someone's mind about that property. So for example, if I know that anytime we turn on the switch in the kitchen, it messes with something in the bedroom, that would be good to know before I buy this house, right? So that's an example of a material fact. So something that about the property that, if we know about it, may alter our decision on that property, may cause us to change our mind about the property. Now, as a realtor, as the seller's agent, it is your duty to disclose material facts about the property that affect the property's physical condition or the property's safety, structure, all of those type things, even if the seller says not to disclose to anybody else. Even if the seller says, oh, don't tell anyone, guess what? If you're going to take that listing, you have to disclose, because this is a legal thing, not necessarily an agency relationship. One of our duties to our clients, if you remember, is confidentiality. This will not fall under confidentiality. Next thing is patent defects versus latent defects. Patent are the things that we see, so they are visible. Not necessarily disclosure isn't needed, okay? So patent, visible, disclosure isn't needed. Latent, on the other hand, is not visible through a visual inspection of the property, and it must be disclosed if known. Example of a patent defect would be, I walk into a room and I can tell that the hardwood floor is scratched, right? There's no carpet that's covering it. Latent defect, on the other hand, is if, for example, behind the wall, there are termites that have infested the property, right? The termites eating into the property, or there's a foundation issue, right, that we won't see if we just came into the home. That would be an example of a latent defect. So if the seller knows about a latent defect, they need to disclose it to you, the agent, and then it's your responsibility to make sure that it's disclosed to the buyer side. Latent defect, not visible, must be disclosed. Patent defect, visible, no disclosure needed. Fraud versus negligence. Fraud is intentionally trying to deceive someone. So you're lying to them, giving them false information, or intentionally withholding information so that they can go ahead with the purchase and you get your commission. Or on the seller's side, the seller is withholding information so that they can sell the home and move on. All right. So as a realtor, if you know, you disclose, otherwise you could be liable for fraud. Negligence, on the other hand, is something that you should have known that for some reason you didn't know. Perhaps you were ignorant, or you didn't do your research or your homework on the property. And so you either gave false information or you failed to give correct information because you didn't know. So it's more unintentional, right? Negligence is more unintentional. Fraud is intentional. Stigmatized properties. These are properties that something bad or terrible or something has happened in the home, or other people just see it as a place that they don't want to live. All right. For example, if it used to be maybe a halfway house for the city, and then now it's like, I don't want to live there. I don't know what's happened in that house. Or even more like sensitive would be maybe someone died in that property, or it was a site of a suicide, right? And so people may not want to live there because of that. Illinois law does not require the seller or the seller's agents to disclose stigmatized properties to potential buyers. Okay, so we're talking about seller side. On the buyer side, you could disclose to your buyer. That's not a problem, but the seller is not obligated to disclose. Now, if we ask, we have to be honest, right? Or we just say, I can't talk about that because my seller told me not to disclose that information. All right, now, just to keep yourself safe, if you're ever not sure, and this is kind of how they may ask you this question on the exam. If you're not sure, two things you do. Number one, talk to your sponsoring broker, and maybe both of you can decide what to do or how to disclose it if you need to, or you still talk to your sponsoring broker and both of you then talk to an attorney who will help you figure out whether or not you should disclose it for liability issues. All right, so stigmatized, we're not necessarily required to disclose. However, talk to an attorney if you are not sure on what you should or shouldn't disclose. Megan's Law. In Megan's Law, this is a law that was implemented so that convicted sex offenders who live in the community register with a database, a government database, so that residents there can look on the database to see if any registered sex offenders are in the community. As real estate agents, when you're working with a seller, you are not required to look up that information and then provide it to the buyer side. If the buyer should ask you, you tell them to do their own research. So on the exam, Megan's Law, if there's any issue about sex offenders in the community, you direct them to the right place. All right. The answer you would pick would not be, oh, we don't talk about that, so I'm not giving you the answer. I'm not telling you. No, that's not what you say. You're providing care to your clients. You're being a professional. So your response should be something that guides them in the right direction. Now, we've been talking about disclosures with our sellers and things like that. So you may be thinking, okay, what if there's so many things and am I supposed to remember them all and write them out and blah, blah, blah? The answer is no. If you remember, there is a form that the seller needs to fill out. The Illinois Real Property Disclosure Form. It is an Illinois statewide form, okay? So the seller is required to fill this form out themselves, not you, the agent. On the exam, even if it's something like, oh, the seller says they're having a hard time reading, they're having a hard time with translation, they're having a hard time with this and that and the other. On the exam, you are never to fill this out for your clients. And even in real life, you're never to fill this out for the clients. Illinois law says the seller fills it out themselves. All right, so I'm sharing my screen with you because there is something on this form that I wanted to point out to you all. So this is the Illinois Realtors Residential Real Property Disclosure Report. It is Illinois law. So you can see here the law number or whatever it's called. All right. Now, if we scroll and read this stuff, it just says that the seller is required to fill out this information, even if it's an as-is sale. All right. There are some instances where the seller does not have to fill this out. Don't worry about that for the exam. Just know that the seller gets to fill this out. All right. And it should be given to the buyer prior to the sales contract being signed. Okay, so the buyer should get it before they sign the sales contract. Right? Because this is a legally binding contract, the seller is advised to consult with an attorney. All right, so the seller fills this out, their name, property address, the date that this information is valid, and then they get to answer these 24 questions. So we ask them about material defects in the basement, the roof, the windows, walls, pool, electric system, plumbing, everything, all right? It even goes down and asks about water, heating, fireplace, septic tank, radon, and all of that, all right? If the seller says yes or not applicable, they need to state why in this section as well. Then they sign it. When the buyer gets it, the buyer reviews, and then the buyer signs. It says here that they could choose to negotiate the agreement based on the data that they receive from this contract, or from this form. All right, so the buyer signs it, and then there are other things here. All right, so the main thing I want to show you on this form is section 40, right here, material defect. Okay, so this is saying the form needs to be filled out. If the buyer does not receive this prior to signing the sales agreement, they have 5 days after they receive this form to cancel or terminate the contract or any other agreement and have all their money returned. So as a seller's agent, it is your responsibility to make sure that this form is filled out by the seller. And remember, there's the radon and the lead form as well that may be needed. All right, so make sure these are all filled out, and then it's given to the buyer's agent before they sign the contract. Otherwise, they could back out in 5 days. So that's part of our duty of disclosure when working with sellers. So as a recap, we talked about material defects, we talked about material facts, right? They need to be disclosed if they have anything to do with the physical condition of the property. Then we talked about latent and patent defects. We talked about fraud and negligence, and then stigmatized properties, Megan's Law. All right, so know which ones we need to disclose, which ones are not, disclosure isn't required for. When I showed you the Illinois real property disclosure form, I mentioned the lead and radon forms, right? So know when those are needed as well when you're working with a seller. Now, sometimes on the exam, they may give you questions like this, where they ask you, for example, I saw this question in a book where it talked about, like, let's say a family member committed suicide in the home, and the seller says, please don't disclose this information. Now, Illinois law says that if the issue has nothing to do with the physical condition of the property, all right? So even with stigmatized properties, think about haunted houses, all right? So if it has nothing to do with this physical condition of the property, then we are not obligated to disclose. So they will not take any action against us if we fail to disclose that information to potential buyers. All right, so make sure you review those sections in your notes and in your book as you prepare for the exam. And always, like I say, when you're answering questions, you're always picking the best answer, not necessarily the right answer, because 2 answers may be correct. You want to pick the best one. If you remember earlier when I was talking about Megan's Law, I said, the person asked you, do you know if there are sex offenders in the community? There might be 2 answers to that on the question. Let's say you get that as a test question. So one answer is, I don't know if there are any sex offenders in the community. The second one is, hey, there is a website where you can look to see if there are sex offenders in this community. Which would be the better answer? The better answer is the one where you tell them, I will give you the website to check and see if there are any sex offenders in your community. All right, same with school districts, same with different other kinds of questions where we're not necessarily supposed to just tell them where to go or give them the answer. The burden is on the buyer to do their own research in that situation. All right, so with that, we've come to the end of today's video. Hope this was beneficial to you. Let me know in the comments what you think about disclosures and if you have it down as you're studying or if you need to go back and do a little bit more studying. As always, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check the description for links to if you want to schedule a time with me just to go over your studying patterns and whatnot. If you also wanted to grab the free planner to help you plan out and map out your schedule, plan out and map out your studying time, be sure to get that also. The link will be in the description as well. All right, until next time, have a great day and happy studying to you.